And now I will turn things over to Cassandra to begin the presentation.
Good morning, and thank you for being here. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? I usually introduce myself to school and staff this way. My name is Colleen Hansen, and I am your archivist. What that means is I collect, preserve, organize, and make accessible all things visitation since 1873. But today I will say, I'm Colleen Hansen, and I am honored to be a member of the ACWR. We would like to start today with a brief overview of our order's history. It provided the inspiration for our consortium in some important ways. We need to put humility aside for a minute and shout out our founders for not only being amazing humans, but also an archivist's dream. Stay tuned. The Visitation Order was founded in 1610 in Annecy, France, deep in the heart of the French Alps. St. Francis de Sales and St. Jane de Chantal co-founded the order. He was the Bishop of Geneva, but chose religious life at the dismay of his family. They had determined his future profession to be a lawyer and a statesman. She was a young widow of a baron with 4 children. He became her spiritual director after she heard him give a beautiful sermon that lifted her out of her deep sadness after the loss of her dear husband. After the two were introduced, they quickly created a bond of holy friendship. This is where the archivist's dreams patronage comes in. They communicated chiefly through extensive letter writing, and they kept them. Jane's desire to enter religious order after the tragic death of her husband was impeded because women's orders during that time period usually excluded older women, widows, and those who were not physically strong enough to carry out the vigorous work of religious life. Together, Francis and Jane determined that these women indeed had a place in religious life. They drafted a constitution and customs, and Jane became the first superior at the house at Annecy with 2 other sisters. They decided to call their order the Visitation of Holy Mary because they were inspired by the holy friendship that Mary and Elizabeth shared. Their meeting, in which Mary traveled many miles to Ein Karim to share the news of her immaculate conception with her cousin, who was also blessed with an unlikely to be with child, is the epitome of the sisters' message to bring Christ to all you meet. Their motto, the Visitation Order's motto, is Live Jesus, and it is based on the spirit of deep humility before God and great gentleness toward neighbor. In Francis's words, the sisters were called to live the little virtues: simplicity, to ask for nothing and refuse nothing in accepting God's will, to grow where you are planted, to attract with honey and not vinegar. They were to do things all through love and not through constraint. In line with Francis's definition of love as the bond of perfection. The Visitation Order was short-lived as a diocesan foundation and quickly became a formal religious order with papal enclosure and solemn vows in 1610. Each Visitation monastery was, and still is, autonomous, presided over by a superior elected for 3 years, renewable for 1 term. The order quickly swept through France, Italy, and Switzerland. When Francis died in 1622, there were 13 foundations. Jane carried on the work and founded a total of 80 monasteries before her death. Fun fact, St. Margaret Mary Alacoque is a Visitation sister, and she professed at Paris-le-Monial in France, whose Visions of the Sacred Heart we are celebrating this year for their 350th Jubilee. Most of the foundations were made during the French Revolution during the time of Jansenism, both strongly opposed to Catholicism. And by the end of the 1700s, revolutionaries had disbanded many of the French monasteries. It was at about this time in America that Father Leonard Neal was appointed president of Georgetown University. He knew about Francis de Sales and Jane de Chantal and the Visitation Order, and thought its constitutions and way of life would be a great fit for religious life in the New World and the frontier. He helped 3 pious ladies who wanted to be Catholic religious to start a community with the Georgetown Foundation in 1799. They lived in community, prayed the divine office, and established a school for girls. They became papally recognized in 1816. The Georgetown Monastery grew rapidly and became crowded at the same time that many Americans were moving west. Religious communities were scarce in the American West, and bishops began seeking orders willing to create new foundations and schools. In 1833, 6 sisters from Georgetown set out to create a foundation in Kaskaskia, Illinois. It was not long after the Kaskaskia Foundation was established that another St. Louis community was formed. After a great flood and the Mississippi River deciding to reroute itself, the 2 houses combined to create St. Louis Visitation. They were called to carry the charism through educating girls just the same as the Georgetown sisters were doing. Their reputation as good and kind educators drew students from all over the Midwest. At the request of 17 gentlemen who desired a visitation education for their daughters, Bishop Grace of the newly formed St. Paul, Minnesota Diocese asked Mother Superior in St. Louis to send a cohort of sisters to create a foundation for the growing Catholic population in St. Paul. Nearly 40 years after the first Kaskaskia Foundation, another group of brave women came up the Mississippi River to create a foundation in St. Paul. This location, too, would both be a convent and a school for girls. As prescribed by Francis and Jane, each house operated autonomously. This means that a mother house does not exist, nor is there an overarching governing structure. We recognize Annecy, France as our first house for the order and Georgetown for the American visitations. But each house contains its own governance structure, beholden to no one but themselves. Our schools, too, remain independent and non-diocesan, keeping with this tradition. Fun fact, our students connect with other Viz girls through a program called Vistery, where they meet at rotating sites, perform a week of service, and grow the Visterhood. While this autonomy and independent status remains true, a papal decree in the 1950s, Sponsa Christi, called for religious houses to create federations. The idea behind this was to provide more support for the sisters and hopefully bring in and retain more professions. What that gave to the Visitation sisters was a new opportunity for community and connection. The houses without an apostolate, like a school or retreat center, became members of the First Federation. They were strictly contemplative. Those houses who maintained an apostolate became members of the Second Federation. Our houses are a part of the Second Federation. While the Visitation Sisters worldwide had already communicated by letter annually, another archivist dream, federating provided the opportunity for more frequent communication and interaction. The houses began sharing sisters, meaning sending sisters to other houses that had a need for a specific skill, like bookkeeping or teaching science, which hadn't happened under their strict cloister regulations prior to this. But they had also started to gather together in person annually and created a true bond of love and friendship in the tradition of Francis and Jane. Fun fact, in a way, Jane had the first apostolate when she ran a soup kitchen out of her grand estate in Bourberie, France. I always say that wrong. Is that Bourberie? In addition to creating this loving bond against all American Visitation sisters, it gave us, the schools and apostolates, a way to go forward when the sisters would no longer be with us. At the Federation meetings, the sisters worked tirelessly to create concrete guidelines that would ensure the charism of Francis and Jane lived on through the work of the laity. As the visitation houses come to completion, the apostolates remain and are thriving. The sisters also saw the value and need to bring in lay archivists to ensure that their legacy will live on. We are not only called to collect, preserve, organize, and make accessible all the records of the visitation institutions. We are called to help carry the charism of the visitation into our schools and communities.
I always have to point this down quite a bit for myself. Let's see. Hopefully it stays put. Hello, thank you, Colleen, for that absolutely wonderful and very informative history of the Visitation. I am Cassandra Berman. I am the monastery archivist at Georgetown Visitation. I'm going to build a little bit on that excellent history that Colleen provided. As she has alluded to several times, many things about the Visitation equal an archivist's dream, so I will use that as my starting point. Visitation houses long knew the importance of maintaining records, as do many other of the congregations represented here. The rules of the Visitation stipulate that inventories of furnishings and other goods must be maintained, that novices' possessions upon entrance must be documented, and that the sisters' vows and their annual renewal must be tracked. In addition, assistant superiors were charged with keeping a daily log, and it was the convention for each monastery to send annual circular letters and death letters to the other visitation houses, creating so many records for us now to organize. In addition, visitation houses produced annals, financial ledgers, business correspondence, school records, meeting notes, and more. Over time, these documents form the basis of an archive for each house. Some of these archival materials in the past were used for dissertations and published histories. One example is A Story of Courage, which is about Georgetown Visitation. This was published in 1894 and was based on the manuscript collection at Georgetown. And other histories of the monasteries also made ample use of their archives. And I should mention that many of our own sisters have created these dissertations and these histories, which is pretty remarkable and very special resources for us. So, even with this early acknowledgement of the importance of records, record creating, record keeping, and actually studying these records, it was not until the early 1980s that the American visitation houses really began to identify a clear need for an archivist among their communities. And in 1984, Colleen unearthed a document, well, not in 1984, about a year, I think, after she began her position, she unearthed a document which was very helpful for her, and it was produced in 1984. So this was from the Visitation Monastery in Mendota Heights, and it was clear that they had, at that time, decided on establishing a more formalized archives program. And she had found an archives policy and procedures document, which I think is a great kind of foundational document for all of us here to work off of. And it stated a great justification for an archives program. Quote, "The records of a religious community provide for its members and others an account of God's actions in their history." So I think that is something that I try to remind myself of as we complete this work, and I know my colleagues do as well. It also stipulated that the archivist must collect, preserve, and make available these records, as well as engage in outreach, such as exhibitions and oral history interviews. So it was quite forward-thinking. This effort also makes clear that the work of sister archivists would be deeply connected to preserving the legacy of visitation. In the 1990s, some projects required a more serious examination of archival organization. At Georgetown, my institution, for example, there was a 1991 application for the National Register of Historic Places that my colleague, Sister Maida Ann Gale, who's pictured here in this lovely image, she was the driving force behind that. So that required a deep examination of the archival records, so she could put that together and achieve that status. And she also worked to secure an NHPRC grant, and that led to the hiring of a sister historian from another order to help her organize Georgetown's archival materials. That was Sister Dolores Liptak, a Sister of Mercy, and I believe longtime ACWR member. And she was able to come to Georgetown Visitation Monastery and work with Sister Maida Ann Gale to develop record group series, an early computerized catalog, which they were able to actually borrow a system that was currently in use at Georgetown University. Georgetown University gifted this system to a few different religious orders, so that was a very nice tool for them to use, an example of sharing of archival resources. And they worked on cataloging the monastery's holdings. Sisters undertook other projects that required well-organized documents, including necrologies, studies of school curricula, and many more sort of reference materials that we refer to all the time. So they did an excellent job, and it really required being deeply enmeshed in these records and deep familiarity. And finally, in 2014, the second federation that Colleen alluded to, so that's sort of the consolidated leadership of the autonomous second federation visitation houses, they actually proposed forming an archives committee of sisters. Specifically, this proposal stated that we hand on our legacy through the preservation of our archives in each monastery of the federation. And they recognized that this was needed to help with the following. First, how to handle the archives of closed visitation houses and schools. What would happen to these very, very important records? Second, how to protect the visitation legacy now with an eye to the future. And third, how to one day partner with the laity, which they also refer to as the professionals, to accomplish this. And that is where we come in here. This is a photo from our first sort of in-person meeting of visitation archivists last summer in Mendona Heights, Minnesota. So how was this proposal from the Federation, this 2014 proposal, actually put into place? Well, I mentioned that sort of the first hiring of an archivist was from 1995 to 1997 at the Georgetown Visitation Monastery. But this was very short term. This was great because Sister Dolores Liptak, the Sister of Mercy, had previously worked with the Carmelites of Baltimore, and she had recognized that in some ways, similar records were produced in a similar governing structure, so that kind of formed the basis of the record groups which she helped devise. But this work didn't continue after the end of this grant funding, so that work was finite. And it really wasn't until 2016 that the first move was made to enact the Federation leadership's proposal of handing on the legacy by preserving the archives. And this was done, as so many things we're discovering right here in St. Louis, when my colleague Amanda Jazorski was hired as the first lay visitation archivist. The Visitation Monastery in St. Louis was ready to do this in part because the sisters there had recently moved out of the monastery, and it seemed like the right time to both hire an archivist and, crucially, set aside funding for a suitable repository. And Georgetown followed in a fashion by hiring an art historian named Susan Naligetti, and she was tasked with working exclusively with the school archives. The monastery collection was and remains separate, so they weren't ready for that yet, but she primarily did historical research rather than archival organization, so she was kind of making inroads into this charge. And in 2016, also, Sister Brenda became the sister archivist for the Visitation Monastery in Minneapolis, and a role that she has remained committed to among her many other duties. And we'll talk about this later, but it's very, very crucial for us as lay archivists to have a sister archivist to partner with who can both speak archives and speak sister, and it's pretty wonderful model for us. We're very fortunate. And a few years later, in 2019, the Visitation Monastery in Mendota Heights, Minnesota, was similarly ready to hire its first lay archivist. The sisters there had also recently moved out of the monastery, and they too were committed to supporting both a professional archivist and the construction of suitable archival storage. And that is when Colleen came on board. She also came on board right in time for COVID shutdown, so she had the I'm sure very interesting experience of the monastery had recently vacated, so I think social distancing was not a problem, but she was working in a very unique setting during that time. Then, in 2021, I should mention that Susan Nalagetti, the school historian at Georgetown, moved on to other projects after about 4 years, which paved the way in 2021 for my colleague Genevieve Kashenda to be hired as the Georgetown Visitation Preparatory School archivist. And I think the staff there in the Salesian Center had realized that it would be very, very important to have somebody who didn't have to have this dual role of school historian and archivist and could be really solely committed to establishing a school archives program, which is what she has done. And then finally, in 2023, Georgetown Visitation Monastery decided it was also time for them to hire its first lay archivist. So I began in the position a little more than a year ago, and I've really enjoyed learning from the former sister archivist, Sister Maida Ann, from the previous slide, and the other sisters who live in the community. So my position is somewhat different in that I am working in the sister space, and it also means that whenever I have a historical question, I'm flagging down a sister in the hallway and having absolutely wonderful conversations. So I'm very, very fortunate there. However, of course, as we all do, we faced some challenges. We were really each operating as a solo archivist. We had our own distinct collections. We are geographically not connected, apart from Genevieve and myself. And we faced many of the challenges that, of course, many of you have also faced and continue to, of being solo archivists, which meant that as we were beginning to organize our archives, we didn't have other lay colleagues to turn to with questions about setting up our programs and of the archival nitty-gritties, and also questions about becoming familiar with visitation records. My situation being slightly different, and of course, there were sisters around and are around in our various locations to help answer some of those questions, but our sort of colleague format is different from working at other types of archival institutions, for sure. And it was also hard to ask for or justify certain tools and technologies, such as a content management system, since in our disparate format, it would really only be used by one person. We do not have staffs working under us with the archives. And so those can be big expenses for using for only one person, one archivist. Luckily, over time, however, we were able to become only semi-solo archivists because we found each other. And this really began when Amanda was asked to help write the lay archivist job description for the Mendota Heights Visitation Monastery. And because she had already served in that role for a few years, she was looked to for her expertise to help establish what would eventually become Colleen's position. And Amanda and Colleen were able to meet in person after Colleen was hired. And they were also going to meet Susan, the archivist and historian at Georgetown Visitation, but then COVID happened and made those sorts of connections obviously considerably more difficult. Over time, however, and with encouragement from other key school personnel, as well as the Zoom culture that began during COVID, Colleen, Amanda, and Sister Brenda began to meet virtually, and Genevieve and I joined this informal group when we were both hired, and we began to meet monthly. And this development meant that we now had archivist colleagues. We could begin sharing resources like finding aids, lists of subject headings, and background readings. So very substantial documents and materials that would help all of us complete our work. And though we were all in somewhat different situations, we greatly valued connecting over our shared history and charism. This is something Colleen discussed in wonderful detail. But it's always really exciting when we realize, oh, we've got the records of this sister here, and then she moved on to help found the St. Louis community, and we can sort of track those records and those individuals, which is fantastic. And we began to think about possibilities for further and perhaps more formal collaboration over the course of these monthly meetings. So that has been an absolutely wonderful resource for all of us, and it has only developed and deepened. And so I will hand it off to Amanda to talk about that.
So Cassandra talked about how we developed this collegiality on our own, and how each visitation community had established our roles. So I'm going to talk about how we came to be an official archives committee of the Second Federation and how that led us into being a consortium. So in the spring of 2023, we were contacted by the Second Federation Council to specifically preserve Federation history. We met with Sister Mary Grace McCormick, who is here today. Give a little wave, sister. Yeah. Who has also been a leader in the movement to preserve visitation history. But she met with us to say that the Federation had talked for years about preserving Second Federation history, as well as just the visitation story in the United States and even in the world. But now the Federation wanted to pull all Federation materials to a central location and hire an archivist to care for them, which is why we were convened. So kind of advisory, kind of as like a search committee. After our meeting with Sister Mary Grace, we all had kind of a debrief session to figure out what the sisters were asking of us, because we really felt like they were asking multiple levels. But what we kind of determined was this charge. The sisters wanted us to help preserve their legacy and charism for future generations through their archives. And it was up to us to provide them with recommendations on how to do that. And I think that word recommendations is very key, because it is the sisters who make the decisions. We can only give them professional advice. So once we had this charge, we felt confident in being able to provide professional recommendations to support their ultimate goal. So in terms of a centralized Federation-based archive with its own archivist, we actually recommended against this. First of all, there were a lot of logistics that would need to be answered, including where would this new archive be located? Once an archivist is hired, who's overseeing her work? Who's paying her? Who's paying for insurance? And thinking about all of this in terms of the Federation's ultimate completion. Secondly, the Federation materials are housed within each of our respective archives. It seems that whoever was president of the Federation at the time kept the materials at her monastery, so we each have materials from the Federation in our archives. And I can say in St. Louis, sometimes these materials are in other administrative and research files, and to pull just those couple documents out would really destroy the provenance and the research value of the wider collection. So for these reasons, we recommended that the Federation consider using and supporting the resources they already had in place. Through their monasteries and schools, they already had 5 physical archives, 2 of which have recently been updated, ours in St. Louis, and then this is a photograph of Mendota Heights storage. We have temperature and humidity control, we have shelving to maximize our space, and we also have security features in place. The Federation also has 5 archivists. We have professional training, but we also have background specifically in visitation records, visitation charism, visitation community. And we are employed by larger, more sustainable institutions. We have a direct supervisor, we have a paycheck, we have health insurance. So logistical things that are already in place. And I'd like to say that our institutions are very committed, our schools especially, they want to preserve the sisters' legacy. They want to continue that charism. So they support us in us supporting the sisters in the Federation. So One of the most essential ways we proposed having the Federation support us, because they liked our recommendations and they said, oh yeah, we do have archives, we do have archivists, let's use that. We asked if they could help finance a joint collections management software. In having a joint CMS, we wouldn't have to move Federation materials to one archive to make them accessible. We could keep them in their respective collections and just enter the information into the CMS and know who has what by being part of the same platform. And in turn, that also makes it more accessible to the sisters. A joint CMS would allow us to do it for other topics. Like Cassandra said, we had sisters moving from one place to another on foundations. So I could type in a name and say, oh, look, I have information in Georgetown and Mendota Heights. While we explored multiple platforms, we decided on Archive Space. It allowed us to have that cross-collection search, but also the independence of our own archives. So if we needed to put like restrictions on what one another could see, we have that capability. Archive Space classified this type of setup on their end as a consortium, and that's like what led us to say, hey, we are a consortium. Let's, define that better. So we remain independent entities because our institutions are independent and have their own rules, regulations, goals. So at times we have different priorities and abilities. However, as archivists for Visitation, we have essentially one common mission, which is what you see listed here. Our Visitation sisters work to ensure that their academic institutions for children and young women, as well as neighborhood ministry, continue even with them no longer there. Their charism of gentleness and humility, along with other Salesian virtues, is something that's left to the Visitation communities today, made of lay people to carry on. And as archivists, we have the amazing resource of the archives to share the sisters' lives, contributions, and what they have achieved in terms of their institutions and community. So I would like to share some of the ways that our archives collaborate one another to share Visitation charism through history, independently at our institutions. So this is an exhibit that I put up in St. Louis. It features profiles on individual sisters who were part of our community. I was able to contact my colleagues in Georgetown and Minnesota to get more background and even photographs that we were able to include in the exhibit on some of these sisters. And I have to say, I love highlighting the sisters because I know how unique they are and the skills that they contributed, whereas like most of our community sees them as like cloistered, silent women who are very serious and just kind of one entity. So I always love to highlight their individual personalities. For their 150th anniversary, Colleen installed an extensive exhibit sharing the history of the sisters and their school's development. Classes from grade school through high school went through the exhibit, learning from and connecting with the past. Alumni returned and were able to share memories of one another and the sisters. And because St. Louis founded St. Paul, Colleen was able to use our archival materials to find more information about their founding sisters and community. Sister Brenda is able to share the Minneapolis Visitation archival materials with her fellow sisters and local community. A few times a year, Sister Brenda will dress in traditional habit as St. Jane for the neighbors. And as part of sometimes the Vistory program, our students from our 3 locations go to Minneapolis, and they're able to learn more about Minneapolis's unique way of expressing the Salesian virtues through a neighborhood ministry. They're the only ones in the Visitation US who do that, correct? Okay. No school. Genevieve has developed internship programs with the high school students to allow them to connect and engage on a deeper level with primary sources about Georgetown Visitation school history, and she continues to increase her programming in the classroom with faculty, staff, and alumni. She actually started sharing archival tidbits at their faculty staff meetings, and that's something that Colleen and I now do at our respective locations. Cassandra and her sister archivist are both able to share the volunteerism with the Visi students. The now retired Sister Archivist continues her historian role and tour guide role, walking students through spaces and sharing the history with them. Cassandra has also been able to initiate more sharing of the documents and artifacts from the monastery side with the school. So she's helping maintain that connection between school and monastery. And not pictured here, but I think very important, is that Cassandra holds an archive sharing day with her sisters once a month. So she'll bring out an item or a document, and the sisters can share their memories, which is great for Cassandra, but it also allows them to connect with one another. And now I'll turn it over to Genevieve.
Thank you. Okay, and where's the, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the advantages which we've already touched on. Number one, most people, I think most people in this room and most in religious archives, if you're at a monastery or whatever, you're a lone ranger. And I don't know if you've noticed up there, there's a little picture of a mole and a crown. And so sometimes I have described myself as queen of the mole people, because that's sort of what it feels like sometimes. You're just in your little space, and no one really knows what an archivist is. Come on, let's be honest about it. And so, and I like being queen of the mole people, but not always. And so the fact that you have colleagues, whether they're near or far, is an enormous advantage. And I think there's something about the emotional aspect of working alone, right? That being an archivist presents a real paradox in that we're working with the past so closely, but it's all about the future, right? It's all about saving things for the future. And so that's an enormous responsibility, and it can weigh on you. And particularly if you're working alone and you're making these really important decisions on your own. And so there is there's a job, satisfaction, and also like a real emotional, psychological component to having colleagues that you could just call on the phone or have, I look forward to our monthly Zoom meetings all the time, and there's never not things to talk about and ask and kvetch a little bit, whatever, So we're not alone, and it's and I feel a big difference. I started before we made this consortium, but as soon as I at first connected with Amanda and Colleen, it felt like opening a window. It was just wonderful. So and also having a consortium, one of the advantages is the specificity of the visitation order. And the interrelatedness of our collections, because we have sisters starting at one house, going to another house. So things get literally taken from one house to another, right? And so there's these holes so this sister, what happened to her? And so now it's so easy for us to ask, hey, do you have anything on, Sister Mary Frances from, 1899 or something? And, because the point of what we're all doing here is whatever congregation you're from, is we're trying to tell the whole story, right? We're trying to, good and bad, difficult and celebratory. We're all trying to tell a whole story, because we're talking about human beings, right? And we're also talking about the history of our country, which you can't talk about the history of education. You can't talk about the history of women in education without talking about visitation sisters. So, and I'm sure it's very true in different ways for, lots of congregations around the United States. So also, this is really important, I think, the shared space for storage if needed. Also, collections can stay where they are, which is safer. I feel like so far we've talked a lot about in other sessions here about everything's closing. Where are you going to move it to, and how are you going to decide to move it? Well, we actually don't have to move anything, even if I have St. Louis stuff or I have Mendota Heights related stuff. It can stay with me. I don't have to worry about, putting it on a plane or driving it somewhere. It can stay with me because we know what we all have. And so, and it's also cheaper, right? To keep things where it is. It's also a time saver just to keep things where they are. And then shared costs. I mean, money, that's always, financial considerations are always, number one a lot of times of, what we have to think about. And so we don't have to, so we can share costs of our collection management system, even of travel. The federation, our governing body can take some of the money, but our individual institutions can kick in some money. And so it really is, a cost saver as well. So some of our successes that we've already had, because how long, so we've been a consortium for, what's it been?
1 year.
1 year? Yeah, I mean, only 1 year, I mean, we're very, very young as a consortium. So some of our successes, so we have been able to receive collections from some of our closed houses in Frederick, Maryland, and the Philadelphia one I just love because it happened during this summer before last, and without any contact before saying that it was going to happen, the people from the Philadelphia, the closed house, just literally came to Georgetown Visitation and knocked on the door and said, "Here you go." How many boxes was it?
98, and we're delighted to have it.
And we are absolutely delighted to have. But I think, but that's the point, that we are delighted to have it, and that they know that it doesn't have to go someplace else. It can come to us, and even if sometimes, also as archivists, space is always, money, space, staff, it's time, all of these things are part of what we all have to think about and work against a lot of times. But I think that one thing that I want to emphasize is not everything has to be perfect, right? We didn't have, the beautiful shelves and whatever ready for the Philadelphia items, but they're safe. We know where they are. They're not scattered to the four winds, or something went to this family and something went to that family. I think that's important. Like, what is that? Don't let the perfection be the enemy of just, the good, sort of. And that's part of what happens when you have a consortium as well. Not everything has to be perfect and so perfectly thought out. We're like, we know where everything, we know where things are now, and we know that they're safe and being cared for, which is many times good enough for now, right? Let's see. Oh, and just locating. That's come up in a couple of talks that I've heard today, of like just locating where items from closed houses are. I don't have to do that alone. I don't have to try to figure that out alone. There's 5 of us here, who can work. I'll take this one, you take this one, or I think I know, I've heard something about this. So we work together on these things, and we're all together and we all have different skill sets as well. So some people, are a little more tech. Some people are a little more enjoy doing some kind of research more. I enjoy making stickers. So I don't know if at the bottom there, this is one advantage of having consortium as well. You can make fun merch for yourself. And so I created the sticker in the corner there for our Visitation consortium. And there you go. And so you can make fun stickers. I mean, that cannot be stated enough. And so, and also, again, when you're working alone, sometimes you get into ruts, whatever. But I never feel, I'm very invigorated always by what my colleagues are doing at their schools, and we get ideas from each other, and we use information from each other to do either presentations or or reports, or little pop-up exhibits maybe, or something. It really, it keeps you fresh. It keeps, it sort of keeps you with sort of a youthful energy when you have people that you can collaborate with. Challenges, which there's always challenges. And again, money is the challenge. How to pay for how to pay for things. This is also a way to get leadership involved. To figure out, can some money come from here, can some money come from there, but also, like, my school has a much different financial accounting system. That's this Byzantine thing that for me to get $15 is, I don't even know how to do it anymore, but which is much easier at other schools. So but that, it's a challenge. How are we all going to get reimbursed for for our meal last night? It's going to be different from each school. Again, that's okay. It's all not the end of the world, right? Not everything has to be the same. Getting buy-in, I find, to me personally, I think this is the hardest thing, because you do need buy-in from all of your stakeholders, whether they are lay or religious leadership, your CFO person, your money person. You need the buy-in from everybody. And a lot of times what that means is you don't just explain what your consortium is once. You're going to have to do it again. And a lot of times, I think you saw our mission statement. Having a mission statement, I think, is so important, because it's you point, this is what we're doing. This is what we've been charged to do. This is what we're trying to do. And, it gives you something to constantly point to when you're talking with stakeholders. Because, like I said, sometimes people, it's like, no one knows what we do, right? What an archivist does, or what's an archive. So you have to, there's a lot of explaining in education, and you have to be patient. And that's just a fact of life. Some more challenges. It's just us agreeing on, what our terminology will be. You don't even need that. It doesn't even have to be about a content management system. I think something really easy, if one monastery wants to just have an Excel spreadsheet of things, as long as, and you're sharing Excel spreadsheets on a shared drive. You don't have to have a content management system. You can do it really easy, but you need a shared vocabulary. And so you all have to decide what we call X. Do we say monastery or house? Do we say, those things are really important for, all of us to be working together. There's, understanding the unique qualities of our different communities, because we are, each house is autonomous and has, different little quirks in the way they've been doing things. Again, that's okay. It's all okay. It's all fine. And we're a committee, but also independent collaboratives within our separate institutions, which have different hierarchies and budgets and all of that as well. But that's where, if you get buy-in and you just make sure you put yourself in front of the people who will help you to make these decisions and you need support from, and a lot of times just bring a fun archival item. They love it. People love learning about the history, or seeing, a letter from, 1871 or whatever it is. It gets people's attention. And our collections are at different levels of organization. You saw the beautiful, it looks like the Library of Congress that Colleen and Amanda, have. Mine looks like a dusty closet that has not been opened in decades, for very good reasons, which I won't get into here, but we're at very different levels of processing and surveying our collections. Again, it's all okay. And that's it. I'm going to hand you over to the lovely and talented Sister Brenda.
I'm going to just pull this up. Okay. First of all, I just want to think, we play off of this Visterhood vocabulary quite a bit, and I just want to thank my archivisters. These are my sisters in archives, and so they are my archivisters. We've got a little text group going and everything, so that's one of the ways that we keep in touch and share wonderful findings or frustrations or what have you. So I want to talk a little bit about our future goals, and I want to start by this quote that I found from the 2014 Federation Assembly minutes, where they were really kind of beginning to get, the sisters were kind of beginning to get things together and say, we need to do something about this archive. And they had a proposal in 2014. And in that proposal, they had this quote. It says, handing on our spirit and our charism can be done most easily by story and example. Access to the stories of the past and displays of conditions and events of the past can keep interest alive in order to model and encourage present-day practice of the charism. And as I found that, because that was the year that I even just was introduced to the sisters, I wasn't even a novice yet at that time, but it just reminded me, it's so much of what Sister Mary McGlone was talking about and what Chris Allison was talking about and what we've mentioned here. The past is worth preserving because it shapes and informs our future, and it's so much relationship. So the sisters had that vision in 2014, and as some of my archivists here have pointed out, it took a little while to get around to hiring archivists and bring in the laity and get professionals. So it's not been a straight line from point A to point B, and it's still not a straight line. So it just encourages me that even in 2014 and see where we are today, there was that vision, and that vision continues. We have that support from our greater Federation body. And also, it's not very clear, and like I say, we don't get from point A to point B very easily, but we're talking about, we formed a Visitation Archives Consortium because we had this content software management system that gave us that vocabulary, but we were already working together in collaboration before that kind of cemented it and concretized it. And so we talk about the committee, we talk about the consortium, and they're kind of interchangeable at this point because the committee, the Federation's Archives Committee, is us. And right now the managers of the Visitation Archives Consortium is us. So we're one and the same at this point, but as we move forward, there's going to probably be some differentiation, or the committee may go aside and we just call it the consortium. I don't know. In our history as a federation, as an order, as in most of us, things develop organically, and as they're needed and as it unfolds, whatever's most practicable is what is done. So you may hear us talk about the committee or the consortium. At this point, they're pretty interchangeable. So for our short-term goals, we will continue, especially as a committee, we've been tasked to support the sisters in the monasteries and in the schools to whatever their archival needs are, to carry the charism, what advice, recommendations, guidance can we give. And I say we, I call these my professional colleagues. I just have a degree in history and a love for history and some library science, but I've not got that professional level. So I'm very appreciative of that level of expertise that my lay archivists bring to this conversation. So we all work together and we support the sisters. I do a dual role there. And we also just, as we mentioned, our collections are in different levels of organization. So we are just slowly moving forward and getting our collections cataloged using our new content management system. And once more, we're all in different places on that, trying to get it standardized and what have you. So short term, we just continue to support the sisters in their goals, archival goals, and help them understand how we can help and what they may need, and then also catalog. Then we've got two kind of long-term categories of long-term goals. The first is long-term goals regarding transitions within our houses. Some have already come to completion, and as you heard, these boxes just show up at Georgetown because it's our founding monastery in the United States. A lot of houses just think, oh, archives, send them to Georgetown. And so that's what happens. And Georgetown may not have the space or the resources at this point to actually process those, but at least we know they're safe. They've been moved, they've been transitioned to a safe place until we can get to them. There's also houses that are in the process of closing, and we've never helped a house close, but other sisters have helped houses close. And so we ask them, we look to see what they've done and what we can offer, and we're working with one particular house at the present moment, trying to understand what we need to do as we move forward, take an inventory. Have they ever had a person who's tried to organize anything, what have you. So we're helping in that transition of houses that have closed already or are in the process of closing. We help ensure appropriate space, especially, like we say, we know they're in a safe place, but it needs to be climate controlled until we get to it and that kind of thing. So these are long-term goals. How do we transition these collections from being in a safe place to being in a safe climate controlled space to actually getting organized and cataloged? There's lots of stuff that needs to happen there at that time. And then also, once more, funding, just to develop a sustainable funding plan. And we're very fortunate that we actually have space as our monasteries close. These 3 schools, we've only got 3 left. We had many schools at one time, but we got 3 that look like they're going to be around for a while. So we're fortunate in that we have those 3 places that can be the repository for our collections, both school collections and monastery. And as we said, it's best if we can keep that in one place, because the schools do use those, and we use it to form faculty, staff, ongoing with alumni board, ACFs. We had to develop ACFs to take over canonical sponsorship of our schools as sisters were no longer there. So it's best practice that they can stay there. And so, but when it gets to funding, the school itself, is a school going to fund a full-time archivist? In some places, actually in St. Louis, they have already taken on that. The other 2 are still, well, actually, yeah, Georgetown has too, but not the monastery. So, how does that long-term look like? And we as a federation also, we will be coming probably to completion in the next 5 years or so. So what does it look like with our resources that we hope to leave in trust for our schools and our archives? And so we don't know what it's going to look like, but that's a long-term goal, is develop sustainable funding for our archives. And then some long-term goals just for us as colleagues is collaboration. We want to prepare the guidelines for cataloging the common vocabulary that we've already talked about, develop access procedures. If you've done it for Georgetown, maybe I can borrow it or use it, or not recreate the wheel, reinvent the wheel. Finding aids, how can we collaborate on that? And then also helping our constituencies in the extended visitation communities to understand archives and how they can support the ongoing formation. We've got lay associates, we've got boards, ACFs, alumni. So, how can we help them understand who we are and how we support them in carrying the legacy as we move forward? And then also we've got some other just kind of fun things. We've talked about working collectively on oral histories, because as we said, sisters have moved around. We've just talked about one sister here this week, Sister Barbara. She's been in 3 different houses or 4 different houses, and so hearing her, and those houses have closed, and so to have her oral history about life in those houses and how they came to completion, it would just be wonderful for us to have a record of. So we've got some different things that we want to work together on, and just in preserving our history as we move forward. So I just want to close with one more quote from 2014, because I think the sisters, I wasn't there at the time, they did such a wonderful job of envisioning this. And they said, preservation of the unique treasures of each of our monasteries and the development of a uniform model of their archives so they may be accessible to our visitation schools, Salesian friends, and historians of the present and future. This is our goal, to make that possible. So I just want to move into the last one here. So we say, we're always fun here. Questions, all ears. And that's just who we are. So we'll open it up to questions now. And I don't know, does the moderator want to do that? Okay.
Round to you, and then they'll answer from the podium, whoever wants to do it. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Before we start, I just want to make a couple last announcements. The time change, the Cathedral Museum is actually going to be 4:30 to 5:30. It will be open today. And then in the next session of programming, the Leadership Encounters Archives is going to move up here and meet in this room instead. That's at 10:45. And then in the last session, another session is going to move up to here, and that will be the examination of a charism-based approach to collaborative archival well, that's what it says, archival preservation. Okay, so that's going to move up here to this room instead of being down on the ground floor. All right, so let's take some questions from the audience. Anybody have a question? Yes?
I just want to.
Wait.
I just want to say that one of the other things that we have in our archives are almost stories of the founding of our cities. We came to places early, and so people that are wanting to know about the cities, we have a lot of the, especially what did people do all day, the ordinary person, not the government people. We have a lot of history that could be helpful to, shall I say, real historians?
All right, anyone?
Hi there, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to hear about perhaps if you have someone who is interested in doing research into the history of the sisters or the cities where they traveled to, how do you handle accessibility issues in terms of someone who's going to want to see things at multiple institutions?
That is a great question and one that we ask ourselves quite frequently. At this point, we do all, I'm sorry, can you hear me? You're not on. I'm not on? Can you hear me? Okay. At this point, our online content management system is just an internal thing, and that is a minor challenge. There are still some reluctancies to put it out online for many different reasons. But at this point, we do just, as we have mentioned, we've collaborated quite a bit. So if we have a researcher that comes to me in St. Paul and says, hey, tell me all you need to know about, well, what can I see on this? And I can invite them in. We all have a way to invite them into our archives. We all have different space accommodations. But then I can refer them to Genevieve or Cassandra or Amanda or Sister Brenda, and we can collaborate that way and get them the information that they need. So I guess one of our future goals is to put, like kind of what Chris Allison said yesterday, is just get it out there so people can find us a little bit more. Because right now we do cater mostly to our constituencies that know us. Our alums are pretty big constituents. A lot of people doing genealogies and things like that. So we do actually refer to our other institutions because of things like that. You absolutely can.
So, Sister Brenda alluded to, I'm standing on my tiptoes here, I'm sorry. Hopefully you can hear me, but Sister Brenda alluded to some of the next steps that we want to take as a consortium, and it was also mentioned that we are very, very young. Our institutions may be old, but we're 1 year old. So one of the things we want to do is we, as professional archivists, recognize, a dire need for consistency in how we present our materials or make them accessible or not to the public. So I think we're all energized to go home and draft common access policies that can actually hopefully be approved at the federation level and be applied across the board. We are all structured differently. So Amanda has a reading room. Genevieve has reading room space as well. I still work in a semi-cloistered community, so accessibility is somewhat, those concerns are somewhat different. I will say that it has been incredibly helpful, this informal structure, and we do discover maybe weekly that maybe a historian or a sister from another order has contacted multiple of us to acquire information, which is fantastic. And to the extent that we can formalize some of these procedures, I think it will really, really help. But the consortium model has also served us well with combining resources that way. So.
Okay.
Hopefully, this is just a short question. Do you know how long it will take before you guys can make that content management system available to the public?
This is where I come in. Yeah, I'm a good bridge. We don't know. And actually, the content management system they've got, it's really multifaceted. You can make certain parts of it available online and other parts keep offline or not accessible. So we still have to learn how all the ins and outs of that, but also we have to educate sisters and then understand where their comfort level is and what's to be made available. So we don't have a timeline, so.
Anybody else? Well, one of the things I wondered, it's slightly off topic, but so I also come from an institution that has a school consortium. And I wondered if the first time that you really got together, we always speak of a holy name spirit in our schools. Did you find that there was a similar kind of feeling amongst, that your schools have a special spirit that you all shared? I mean, that it was, when you came together, it was easy?
I think absolutely we did. So at the federation level, I'm going to get technical for a second. So there's the federation, and then there's a group called the VSN, and that's called the Visitation Salesian Network. And then there's us. So there's the federation, and then there's the Visitation Archives Consortium and the VSN. And the VSN kind of did that work for us a little bit by establishing Salesian spirituality, a common ground for Salesian spirituality in all of our schools, and we have all been formed that way. When we get hired, we are taught essentially the charism, and so we had easily had that common ground and were able to speak to each other that way and had the same spirit and formation guidelines that way. And just as archivists too, I think we were able to find our common ground that way. But absolutely, our schools have done, again, the sisters started that for us and wrote it's called, the booklet that the VSN uses.
Oh, the Introduction to Salesian Spirituality.
They wrote an Introduction to Salesian Spirituality that have 6 governing categories that all of our schools follow. And so we are very much aligned with each other that way, even though we are independent and autonomous.
Learning your vocabulary well. I just want to also say the spirit of the schools is very similar. I've been able to visit each school, and when I walk in each one, I get the same feeling. They know visitation, and the sisters established these schools within their own homes. I mean, so they've got that history, and I think just in the visitation order itself, even though there's not been an official federation structure until the last century, the visitation houses kept that fraternal love, friendship, and what have you among the houses through their circular letters. So there's that relationship there that's from the beginning, and that has been imbued within our schools and that spirit of our schools. So the Salesian spirituality, the visitation charism, is a wonderfully, it's just cohesive spirit that permeates all of this.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question, so I'm going to go to Holly.
Thank you for being here today. I saw that you mentioned in 1984 you had an archives policy and procedures. Did that carry through even to give general guidelines for restrictions, or are you very independent based on house?
I wish that it did. The restrictions have come up more or less on a case-by-case basis. So what do we do about sister private records? What do we do about board meeting minutes? What do we do? I know there's been a lot of discussion about annals too, because there's a lot of information and just historical word use, to say it generally, right? The way things were written in the 50s, we would not write that way now. So there's concerns about that. And I really wish it was more or less a guideline for which records to keep and and how to organize them. It wasn't really at all about restrictions, unfortunately, or sharing at all. It was really meant to be an internal archive for the sisters and the houses. I don't even think it intended to be shared amongst the other visitation houses. I think it was just guidelines for how to do your archive within your own house.
I think that one of the differences is, well, I will just speak for St. Louis. Who the heck knew what an archivist was? We knew that was important because Annecy has these incredible 400 years worth of archives, but what to do, and as soon as Amanda was hired and started working, and one or two people got to know her, and then pretty much anybody else that was around got to know her, our tradition is very much of enclosure. And there's a certain real hesitation about lay people, and certainly not in the enclosure. Well, lo and behold, you start meeting someone, and then it gets open. And I think that's where our sense of holy friendships is what's really important. I think that some of the people at those places would still be real hesitant, but let them sit with one of the archivists and maybe one of the items, and all of a sudden, that restriction goes away. There's a real reverence that our archivists use for our documents, but I think welcoming them into those archives has been one of the best things we ever did.